Good morning. This is on, right? I wanted to take a minute almost immediately and ask for your input for the next 40 minutes. I know what I want to talk about. What I'm curious is, what would you like me to talk about? Now, here's how this goes. 3 of you could raise your hands right now and say, this is what I want to hear, John. Or all of you might be the victim of me coming and asking you a question, which is, what do you want to hear? So we have 3 volunteers. You're all spared me possibly coming to you. There's one. You all should applaud him for leading the way. Tell me what you'd want to hear. Speak loud, I can repeat it.
Hello? Oh, well. Okay, so what I would like to hear is about what you can do to tell us when your router has been compromised.
Got it. Why would that be a topic this day and age? Nothing's been in the news about this recently. Okay, router's being compromised. There's only 2 more people that have to volunteer and you're all safe. Wow. There's no leadership in this room. Come on, people. All right, that means all of you are in trouble right now. This is when you stop looking at me because you're trying to avoid being the person I call on. Give me a topic. Any topic.
About privacy.
Privacy. It's a great topic. Thank you. There are those that claim that we don't have any privacy anymore. I disagree with that point of view. Give me a topic.
How Cisco will handle cloud computing.
Cisco handling cloud computing. All right, 3 topics. How do I detect whether or not my routers have been hit? How do we handle cloud computing? And most assuredly, what's going to happen with privacy? Those are 3 very good topics. In 30 minutes, I think we can cover those. Now, one of the things I was warned about coming here was I might have to do this all in Finnish. The only way I can do this all in Finnish is if I stop talking. So we have another choice right now, which is for the next 30 minutes, I could be totally quiet, or you could allow me to do it in English. Can I ask your forgiveness and do it in English? Would that be okay? Okay, good. Thank you. Because I really didn't want to stand here for 30 minutes not talking. Cisco is in a quiet period right now. We've just completed our Q2, and in just less than 24 hours, we'll talk about our financials. Nothing that I'm about to tell you should advise you one way or the other to buy or sell our stock. What I can tell you about what will happen on the market tomorrow is one of 3 things. Our stock will go up, our stock will go down, or our stock will not change at all. That's the only piece of advice I can give you. But essentially, I'm not going to be talking about our company financials, and I have to put this up here because I have to get back into my own country. And I'd rather do so without being either arrested or subpoenaed for giving you guys insider information. So all of you in the room are going to be my witnesses that I said our stock is going to go up, it's going to go down, or it's not going to change at all. You make your own decisions. If it goes up, I'm taking credit. I've been defending networks for 30 years, since I was 3. All right, maybe a little bit older than that. And what I can tell you in that experience is that there are basic elements about how to protect networks that essentially boil down to these 3 things. Now, I work at a network company. You might think, John, of course you're going to say the network is the way to protect a company. Well, that's true. But what I also know is that especially in this expanding footprint of computing devices that are being connected to networks, there's no antivirus software that runs on a Samsung refrigerator. which tells me that if you use that simple example, and then you move on to something like protecting the sensor networks that are being installed here and in the United States for things like garbage collection and recyclable collection, that as these things are connecting to networks, they're not going to have enough power, they're not going to have enough memory, and they're not going to have enough compute in order to protect themselves. So what's the alternative? The alternative is a network. I'm not saying it's a perfect system, but I'm telling you it's the only thing in my mind that I can come to as an answer. The second one is information superiority. And by my definition, information superiority is having more information at the right time that you can do something with than your adversary does. Earlier this week, I was down in Brussels at NATO headquarters. Last week, I was on the East Coast of the United States talking to a series of our customers. And as recently as yesterday afternoon, I was talking to one of our largest customers here in Europe. And I asked every single one of our customers one question before I really start talking about security, which is simply this: do you know everything about your own IT systems or your ICT systems? And anyone who is being honest with me says no. Now, one of the elements about security that all of you definitely know well is if you have no full, complete sense of how these systems are working together, how in the world you're going to safely protect them is beyond me. So information superiority is about having enough of that information ahead of time, and more than your adversary. And then the third element is constant evolving defense. Now, yesterday morning, I released a paper called Advanced Techniques that are implemented in Fortune 50 companies, and it was released to NATO for the 28 member nations and partner nations, of which Finland certainly one. And the goal was to show how defense has evolved already, but also to go back to the very theme of this conference, which is saying in no uncertain terms that back to the basics is a fundamentally difficult thing to do, but absolutely has to be done. And the reason that I found a certain desire to come to this conference in particular this year was because you had thematically said today's day and age has got to be about doing the basics and doing them really well, and that is not easy. Put all this in context as I spend the next 25 minutes talking about what today looks like. Anybody recognize company names on this slide? Every single one of them has been hit in the last 9 months with a significantly sized breach. Every one of them woke up one day and said, I've got a great security practice protecting my company. And then woke up the next day and said, okay, apparently we don't have enough practice in order to protect against everything. I've been on this list. Circa 2004, Cisco got hit. And when you learn in that moment that you have not done enough, despite all attempts, to protect your own company, you then realize that there might never be a full definition of being completely safe, so it's about limiting damage if something goes wrong. A couple of these companies did not catch things fast enough and are experiencing a very difficult discussion with their customers, with their shareholders, and with all of you. And I bring this up because it's as if we've essentially looked and said, how in the world can something like this happen in 2014 after 30 years of building computer security? And one of the ways that I think this happens is because of not evolving your defense constantly. And I know many of these customers and their leaders personally. And they would say the same thing. Security is an afterthought. Security is not baked into how we build things. Security team is off to the side. We didn't invest enough. And it's always seen after something goes wrong. And here's what's going wrong. This is individual malware sampling that I'm sure Miko talked about, I'll talk about, many companies will talk about. But there are some patterns in this, which is that the ability to exploit is growing faster than the defensive systems being able to protect it. And one of the elements that I find particularly interesting about this is that it doesn't seem to have an end. It doesn't seem to have an end. So I look for bounded, solvable problems. I look for a problem we can work. And if this is endless, then I have to look at something else in order to fix what this is telling me. And I'm a data-driven person. More malware is generated in 1 month than in 3 months. You don't know which month it's going to be, and you don't know what next month's going to be. But it will be constantly growing from a total sample size standpoint. So you say to yourself, all right, my next bounded problem, I am a target. That's not a joke, by the way, because Target got broken into and hit. That means that essentially all of us are being individually as companies targeted. And I've talked to small, large, international, national, Finnish, Belgian, Chinese, Australian. I've talked to all walks of life, and every single customer we talk to knows for sure that they are being targeted by somebody for any number of reasons. And what's amazing to me about it is that as you start to realize you are not going to be safe alone, the response should be, let's all work together and actually eliminate the problems. Let's actually start getting after the teams that are breaking in. Let's start arresting more people, changing law, building better defenses, and making sure we get after the problem. It is almost not the right conversation that has happened yet, because we still think of this in technological terms. And I'm as technologically geeky as the next person here, which I gather has something to do with a ponytail, but that I'm noticing more ponytails per capita in this audience than I've seen in a while, so I'm feeling at home. The point being that when we surveyed each one of our 500 customers that are the top ones, we found multiple sophisticated actors in their networks at the same time. All 500. Every single one of them was a sophisticated actor. And by sophisticated actor, you could mean any number of groups. A very clearly intelligence-driven national actor, including potentially the United States, by the way. And then a very serious criminal actor, which is one that's essentially selling the value of whatever it is whatever you're trying to protect. So not just one attack that's tailored, but multiple. In fact, what's really fascinating about the hacking community is that I've watched it in my own network where one team gets in and then another team kicks them out. So one hacker succeeds, the other hacker comes in, kicks the first hacker out, and then tries to keep their foothold. And then this fight starts, all to keep in my network in order to get a foothold. One of the questions is infrastructure, routers being the next attack. I knew this was going to happen. It's inevitable. Routers have IP addresses. Routers are in the middle of communications. Routers are essentially the backbone of how this all works. In 2006, there was research pushed out in the Black Hat community conference that talked about how to attack a router. In 2007, more research was done. 2008, 2011. I spent the last 6 years building defenses against this to answer that question. How in the world do we protect and know if our routers have been attacked? What did we do to answer that question? You'll hear about it in a minute, but I've built something essentially modeled around trustworthy systems, and you've heard those stories before from other companies. We had to do the same thing. We had to realize that we were going to be attacked as a vendor and get ahead of that before it ever happened. So we did. Then you have to realize, and it's a very disturbing thing for me, that I've talked to some of our customers in Fortune 50, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 that don't watch the traffic out of their networks to know if they've been hit. They haven't gotten there yet. And it's because they're basically along a long journey and just haven't managed to get that far. Move on to the idea, and this is one that I disagree with, that we should ever accept. We should not accept that we have lost control of this. I find that unacceptable completely. And yet I'm talking to teams that are essentially saying, I'm going to get hit, I'm going to get hurt, and I cannot stop it, so I'm just giving up. It's just going to happen. Unacceptable. I find that entire idea impossible to allow. Because if it became true in general, essentially that's surrender. And I'm not really up for that. I'm too competitive. And then the last one is this is just essentially a one-upsmanship. An attack, a defense. A new attack, a new defense. A new attack, a new defense. And part of what I'm concerned about is that security teams, my own included, are now operating 42 different vendors' technologies in order to protect a large enterprise. And that is exhausting just to make it all work together. But number 43 is coming after, and number 44 will be after that. There has to be something different we can do than just add more and more and more technology to solve some of these basic problems. And time is not on our side. I know a vendor who was talking to one of their customers and said, well, we had an attack that was resident in our network for 9 months, and we didn't know about it. If you want to take the source code out of Cisco for iOS, which is about 37 million lines long, you can do it in under 3 minutes. So 9 months, you could do it a few times if you wanted to, though I don't know why you'd want multiple copies. But you could certainly do it because you have that much energy and that much time if I can't see you for 9 months. 9 months is game over. You've already essentially been in there so long that it'd be impossible to figure out the total damage. Which brings me to one of the measurements we have to get after, which is how many people, including all of you, are going to be able to protect against all the things I just talked about. We just produced some research that suggests that there are 1 million jobs that don't have qualified people to fill them in the security arena. 1 million. The good news is there's about 1,000 people here. So you're all gainfully employed at least 100 times over. It's a job opportunity, by the way. But it also tells me that if we have 1 million people that aren't ready to actually take on this role, then we have a human capital crisis just as much as a technology problem. Now, how do you solve some of these things? Well, you start studying the past. That's the internet essentially modeled in 1984. How many of you have been working on some sort of version of the internet, be it a dial-up modem pool all the way to something that was really connected since 1984? Raise of hands. How many of you are not willing to admit you're that old, which is the reason you didn't raise your hand? Yeah, I got it. There's a few of you. Honesty is a beautiful thing. Thank you. So if you study history, then you move to 2008. And 2008 is a very interesting year. It's when there were more IP addressable devices connected on the internet than people. That was 6 years ago. And I suspect that if I were to ask all of you, do you have 2 IP addressable devices with you today? A phone and a computer, an iPad? I'd probably get some 30, 40, 50, or maybe all of you to answer yes. But now look at the future. Now, there are estimates that are ranging anywhere from 20 to 50 billion. It's a really hard science to predict how fast this is going to go. But at some point, 4 times as many of the number of people on the face of the earth, 6 times, 8 times. Essentially what's happening here is that we are placing everything on an IP addressable network you can imagine. There are a herd of cows, this is not an exaggeration, there are a herd of cows that right now are on the internet. A herd, I know this is English versus Finnish, but it's a herd of cows, a group of cows. Things that produce milk are on the internet. Why? Because they want to know if any of the cows are sick. There's a house that's on the internet. It actually tells you how it's doing. There's a tree in Belgium that actually tells you how it's feeling. There are dogs that are actually available on an iPhone app to know how and where your dog went. And anybody have children under 2? Yes, a few of you? There are diapers that are now on the internet. I don't know why you'd want to find that out, but I thought you should know. So the real question comes down to this. Who has the advantage? Is it us? Or is it the adversary? Whatever adversary you're facing. And it could be a country, could be a 16-year-old. And I think it's the most essential question you have to ask yourself. Who has the advantage? If we don't have the advantage, then what are we going to do to change it? Because eventually all of us are not going to be doing these jobs anymore. I'm not doing this forever. You're not doing this forever. Miko's not doing it forever. So if we're not going to change the tide today, someone else is going to have to change it. And I'm suggesting that we have to change it right now. Now, part of this is going to very simple premise terms. So my board of directors, we're a 50 billion, largely US company. My board of directors, if I come up to them and speak technical speak, they're essentially going to laugh me out of the room. If I brought up something like kill chain, I think they'd probably think I'm in physical security and I'm shooting people. So what I bring up is something much simpler, which is before, during, and after. That's essentially all that matters during an attack. It's not particularly sophisticated, and it doesn't sound particularly cool, but it is the simplest way that we've been able to, and I've been able to mentally picture every single step I have to take, and then where to make investment. The most expensive part of this investment is after. The least expensive, ironically, is during, and the second most expensive is before. Every single thing that my team does, both building for you and then solving for us, is in these terms. And it took a while. We had huge debates on really smart people and wanted to use much more sophisticated language and cool names. Truth of it is, this is all that the security world is. What are you going to do to make sure it doesn't happen? What are you going to do to handle it when it does? What are you going to do afterwards? And that's how we think and we believe. And our whole company is going to be talking to every customer we have that essentially says this is the way to model your security practice. Theme of this conference. Now, believe it or not, I actually put this slide into the deck before I knew that the theme of the conference was a whole discussion around back to basics. This is hard to do. We've got inside of our company about 700,000 IP addressable devices. And part of what we learned on multiple occasions is there were little dark corners of our environment we didn't see before. I've found that to be very true of almost every enterprise company and any network of any size. Patching is one of the more complicated things to do in life, and yet it's the most effective thing in many cases that you can do to protect yourself. So when I say go back to the basics, when you talk about it, this is not what, by the way, I typically get my team excited about. They want to go and buy the latest technology from FireEye, from Damballa, Mandiant, RSA, anybody. They want to go after like the cool stuff, the APT stuff, let's get the nation network attack done. Let's get instrumentation around it. Truth of it is, efficacy has to be one of the measurements of what the security industry has to do better. All of us have to do this much better than we have. Because when I ask my own team what's effective and why, I don't usually get the detail. Well, it worked. I caught this many attacks. How many did it let go by? Might be just as equally important. Because work and results are not the same thing. I want to know results. You should want to know results. How effective is something that you've done? And is it effective enough? That's what back to the basics is for me. Provable, effective, basic techniques that provably up to 80% of your risk surface is reduced to zero. That was proven by 2 different studies done in Australia, where they did patched and unpatched systems and then took essentially how much could be the attack surface of a given network on both systems, routers, computers, software, hosted applications, infrastructure. Up to 85% of the risk surface can be reduced to zero. That's one of the most effective set of steps. Hard to call up my chief financial officer and say, you know what I need $1 million for? Patching. Doesn't sell, but it has to. Plain and simple. But what we can also do is do things that we couldn't do 20 years ago, 30 years ago when I started doing this. You can reboot computers so fast and you can build enough compute cluster that trying to keep persistent foothold on a computer is impossible. I actually am deliberately rebooting computers inside of our data centers now. Restoring them back to zero. Starting all over again. It's very difficult to get a foothold on a moving target. But think about what we've managed to do. Does anybody, you may not want to admit this, does anybody like shooting guns? Nerf guns. Let's go with Nerf guns. It's safer. Here's what you know. And here's what anybody that's ever thrown a baseball knows, or ever pitched, or ever actually shot on goal. If the goalposts in European football were moving around, do you think it would be as easy to score a goal as it is now? If they were literally moving around on the backside of a given field? No. If you keep systems stable exactly where they are and don't move them, then it's easier to attack them. Just makes sense. Moving target, try and hit it. A lot harder than fixed target, absolutely can hit it. Virtualization is starting to allow this. We can literally move networks around and make it very complicated for an attacker to actually keep a foothold on it. This is brand new thinking. We couldn't have done this 20 years ago. We could barely have done it 10 years ago, and maybe not even 5. Moving target defense. That's not back to the basics. That's using the same compute cluster that's being used for maximum CPU, for the whole IT costing centers, to absolutely take care and lower the footprint of data centers to the advantage of security teams. And it can be done today. The good news and the bad news of the emerging future. Software-defined networks, networks that literally change themselves through software controls. And we're called one controllers. Again, brand new. Arguably very dangerous if done wrong. But one of the more interesting advantages that we can have is you don't see the same network. You come into my network today, you come into my network tomorrow, it actually looks different because you've changed it dynamically. We demonstrated this last year where we literally had an attack going and then reconfigured the network topology so it looked totally different. The services were still working. Any normal user was still able to actually take advantage of it. But an attacker suddenly had no idea. All the reconnaissance they had done makes no sense because the network doesn't look the same. That's confusing. Anybody either been a part of or still a part of an attack team where what you do is try and break into networks either because you're in a consultancy or because you've been part of a military team that does it? Anybody done this before? A couple of you have. Start moving around and it becomes incredibly complicated to be successful, especially if you no longer can see what it is that you saw before yesterday. And the probably most important thematic of this is that if you see only your data, you're not going to see enough. It's just not going to work. And it's because an attack that might start in Korea might then move over to Finland. If you could see it before it came to Finland, and there's only so many ways you can do that, then the only way you'll be protected is if actually you're participating in the same grid that's protecting and detected it in Korea. Which gets down to privacy, the second question that was asked today. I'm curious, and there's no particularly right answer. How many of you believe you have a fundamental right to privacy when you're on the internet? You believe that you have a right to privacy when you're on the internet. How many people believe that? Okay. How many of you that believe it believe you actually have privacy when you're on the internet? And I suspect it's almost nobody, right? One of the defining problems of today. How can you have privacy when participating on the internet? What rights do we have in a globally connected world where one person's privacy is different than another's? And I tell you, there is no simple answer to this one. What I think is true, though, is you should have a fundamental right to know if you have privacy or not, and why. So, for example, if you're visiting Chinese websites, which I know many of you do, okay, that one, I thought that would have actually engendered a little bit more laughter than that one, then do you believe you have privacy? And the answer is probably no, because the Chinese national state has a very different definition of privacy. It's not right or wrong, it's just different. If you're actually transiting over inside of Russia, you're going into Belgium, you're jumping over the United States, all different definitions of what privacy truly is. The end analysis of this privacy conversation, though, is if your refrigerator is connected to the internet and you're drinking a lot of soda, does your healthcare provider have a right to know the fact that you actually drink sugary drinks? That's the privacy conversation. That is the future that we'd best figure out and say what is right, what is allowed, and what is not. Because I now know of vendors that are planning on giving information about what you eat and drink to your doctor, even if you didn't. And that's not what this was supposed to be about, but it's what's coming. So we've got to start rallying over what we've decided is good and what's bad. I won't get into this too badly because the slides are available afterwards. This is a fully functioned data analytics team for a company. It took almost 10 years to put together for our group. It seems to be sustaining itself as to the full functions of what you need to be able to do right. And in the end, it's where we have to start in order to do detection, and then where you have to end in order to do protection. And then last but not least, where privacy, if not done right here, can go wrong.
Can I have a question?
Hold that thought, and I'll absolutely get to your question at the end. I talked about efficacy as one of a new measurement. Things that have to be done differently in our industry. Things that don't work today that have to change tomorrow. Here's a list. How long is an adversary running in your network before you see it? How fast can they do it? That's not typical questions we've asked ourselves. How expensive is it? How disruptive is it? How much can you confuse them while they're doing it? And then last but not least, how cost effective is this stuff? We don't ask these questions yet. IT does for general IT purpose systems, but we don't. And I'm suggesting that starting today, we should. I'm modeling every bit of what we do now based on these principles. Because it seems to me that they're the right questions. They're not the right questions of how cool is the technology, is this bank using it? Well, if that bank's using it, then I should. I don't know if that's the case. I should find out if it's effective for what I need to prosecute against. But we have to change what we're measuring because human beings, all of us, get what we measure. But we don't measure enough. We don't measure the right things. Is it up? Is it working? No. Is it actually catching exactly what we're supposed to stop? Which gets me to the trust. I've had the delightful experience over the last 2 months of being a US headquartered company. And I've learned that there are 3 types of people. I've learned this much better in the last little while than I ever knew. There's a group of people that essentially say, I'll never believe you. I'm not going to change their minds. Have you ever run into anybody that you just can't convince? Is anybody married to people that they just can't convince? That's a group I can't help. There's a group that wants to believe me, wants to believe us, wants to believe and trust, but we have to earn it. And then there's a whole other group, which is the largest group, which just doesn't generally know. But what I know about being in this world, both working with you and then being a company, is that if we don't get this part right, none of it's going to matter. I'm extremely proud to work at this company, to work at Cisco. I'm extremely proud of what we've always stood for. It has not been fun over the last couple of months to be questioned by just about every national government known to man, including yours. And that's okay. I don't mind the questions. I just didn't say it was fun. But we've always stood for trust. I can't work in a company that doesn't. And I think that's probably true of all of you too. But trust also has to happen in this room. It has to happen between each one of you. It has to actually say, hey, look, I actually have been hit. Here's how the hacker actually did it. Let's actually start bringing this to bear. Let's have the legal teams start to change the law. Let's start to bring this up in the G20, in the UN, in the EU. And let's start changing the rules before next year's conference. Which brings me sort of to the last question. And again, this is all available to you, and I know I'm going to get the hook because you guys all want lunch, which is my conclusions. The left side and the right side are Cisco's network. Does that look like anything that's ever hit a windshield? That's hard to protect if you can't understand it. Back to my point about back to the basics. Know what you're trying to protect. Because I think that the network's actually going to be the only answer in the future that's in common with absolutely everything else that's connecting. I've always said information superiority, back to my first premise, is required to protect. I'd argue that we have a lot of work to do here. I'd also argue that we're on the right course. And you can't do this alone. There's no such thing in the security domain as being alone. If you see only your data, you're not going to be protected. If you only work with your own group, you're not going to have enough information. And if you don't work with each other, I promise you, each one of us will end up being hit systematically, having been hit by the most advanced technique teams that I've ever seen. And finally, not to overly hit this point, as we move into things like cloud, which was one of the questions, and by the way, Finland, for the most part, has been on the leading edge of this with outsourced data centers for most of your enterprise businesses. So you've learned it more than we have for the rest of the globe. One of the things that has to be done is that we have to essentially know when we're using a service, does it meet the criteria of what I needed? So for example, if I'm storing data, what country is it in? Does it only stay in that country? Does it get moved if the data center in that country goes down? Does it get moved to a different country? Do I transit over other countries to get to my own information? What are the rules and the laws of those countries? Those are all the right questions. Now try and make that happen in electronic terms. So you log on, you wake up in the morning, your alarm goes off, you pop your iPhone on, and you have absolutely no idea what country you're in. You don't know what network you've transited, what countries you've been through, what legal rights you have. Try making that happen in electronic terms. I've talked to whole countries. Finland's definitely in this debate. I want the data stored in my country. I've talked to other people who said, I don't trust my government at all. I'd rather put it in Finland because I trust them more than I trust my own. It's an interesting debate, isn't it? But it's the debate of today. It's the debate that ties cloud, which ties it to privacy, which ties it all the way of my routers have been exploited. Because those are the fundamental questions that we have to get right and get fixed. Let me leave one thought. This conference has been going on for 12 years. Congratulations. 1 year from now, you're going to be meeting again. Many of you will be here. My thought to you is simply this. What conversation would you like to have next year? How is it going to be better, less complicated, easier solved, systematically on the right course? How is it going to be different in a year from now? Because that's the question I would have you all ask yourselves. It's the question I ask myself each and every year. What conversation do I want to have next year? Because now you'll know the thematic of Next year's conference should be 2015, better than 2014. That's what I hope to hear all of you tell me. And that's what my last message is. I want to thank you very much for having me, certainly for participating in the conference that Cisco's been very passionate about for a number of years, for being our customers if you are, and for becoming our customers because otherwise you're not allowed out of the room. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, John, for your inspiring keynote. Do we have any questions for John?
There was a gentleman in the front that had a question. I'm sorry, I had forgotten.
The mic is over there.
You can just tell me and I'll repeat it if you want.
Well, when you discussed about virtuality in the network, it doesn't seem the same. Just got me thinking, would it be possible to create some kind of an environment where I can protect my privacy better? Because other way around, it's protecting the network's privacy. I don't mean the old way that we used to log to anonymous.com and we were private. But in this new world, when my information is for sale all the time in the network, so is there any, do you have any kind of insight behind this?
So the question you were posing, and make sure that I got it right, was how can an individual essentially assert or make sure that your own privacy and not trust anything else, but you essentially say, this is my privacy requirement, and ensure that you have it when you want it. Right. Great point. And I think it's actually a pretty important question for how to do privacy right. So there are a couple ways that I think are possible today. Number one is the use of encryption, which is not even done simply well in email at the moment, far less, all the way throughout every other service that we use. So that's number one. The reason that the tools probably don't work really well is because none of us are using them en masse. If Apple comes up with a very elegant version of encryption, we'll probably all turn it on. It's that kind of ease of use that frankly has to be done. But until we start using it much more, I don't think consumer, individual privacy will go up. That's one way. The second way that I think is possible is, and I know this is hard, we actually have to start reading what the terms and conditions of the services are that we use. And I know that's just going to be boring. But it is part of what we have to fight back against is that we're just taking it as is. It's a hard thing. We scroll down as fast as possible, click OK, make it go away, whatever it is that we need. That shouldn't happen. We shouldn't blindly trust it, but we have to inquire. And that takes time. I don't know of an easier answer than both of those two things. You get those two things right, and then we can change what it is that we want. If the terms and conditions are wrong, as a group, as a world, frankly, we should be able to change how it's written. Terms and conditions, by the way, are written by lawyers. That's not anybody that, we typically, well, is anybody a lawyer? Sorry. It's not read like you have no privacy. It should say that in bold red letters. It's not the way it's put. So that's the second way. And then the third and final way that I think is you're able to protect your privacy is you don't have to give up information to get service. It just takes an argument. I had this argument with a credit card agency as recently as 2 weeks ago and said, there's absolutely no reason you need that information. And they said, and the person on the other end of the phone is reading a script going, I don't know what to do if he says you don't need it. And you could just feel the person getting frustrated with me because they had no out. But eventually I won, and they didn't have that information. And that's another way, is you actually push back on what's happening into us today. Thank you for the question. I appreciate it a lot. To follow up?
I'm coming to Amsterdam.
Am I coming to Amsterdam for the CIO Summit at Cisco? I am probably not. Not because I wouldn't want to, but because my daughter's birthday is the exact same time. And it would be great to see you again, but it'd also be really good if the door and key work on my front door to my house. So you can kind of see the risk equation that I'm going to take. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
All right, thank you. Do you know something, John?
Sir.
You are now the only thing between these people and lunch.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you very much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, John Stewart.